There is a battle for talent that has not been felt in the marketplace for many years. Is there talent out there? This is my point, that is being untapped. Yes, there is. I think the latest figures suggested, this is in the UK, 600,000 people with disabilities are out of work and looking for work. That's talent out there.
Today I'm speaking to Jackie Handy. Her mission is to ensure everyone feels safe, valued, and understood at work. She's the creator of BRAVEwork, a program which trains businesses in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Her ethos at BRAVEwork, as well as in her book, The Little Book of Belonging, is to urge for sustained action. In the book, she gives 52 easily digestible ideas to fill a year's worth of sustained focus and application. For Jackie, inclusivity is a cornerstone of a more motivated and successful workforce. Not only that, it makes for trusted and respected organizations. We start by discussing various labels and then move on to gender expression. What are the difference between those? Jackie really helped me to understand this. Well, then we continue to talk about gender identity, gender expression, and how often people around the table are actually the people that already know the drill, that know what to do, and how difficult it is to find the right people to be around the table, those ones that don't know what to do. We also talk about those small little needling remarks that quickly can become something overwhelming, especially if it's constant. Well, Jackie goes on to give us some tips for business and for the difficulties we may be facing on a daily basis. We close our discussion by talking about problems around trust and how to foster that in a working environment, as well as the dichotomy of measuring performance at the individual level, while diversity is at the group level or the team level. Are we measuring the right things? Well, listen and form your own opinion. Hi, Jackie. Glad you're here today.
It's good to be here, Eckstein.
I'm going to launch into something which has been bugging me, There seems to be a misunderstanding of what the difference is between sex and gender, identity and expression. Can you tell us a little bit more about how would you classify that?
Yeah, by all means. So sex is basically the something that you're assigned at birth. It's binary. It's based on your genitals, quite frankly, and it is determined by doctors, midwives, etc. at the point you are born. Simple as that. The thing is that gender is more around your identity and how male or female you feel, or neither. So, what tends to happen, just to put things into context, is you are assigned a sex at birth, which is sometimes called your gender, even though they're not quite the same thing. But you're assigned a sex at birth. Let's say you're assigned the sex female at birth, and because of our societal norms, that sex assignment then determines how you will be treated, how you will be dressed, the toys you will play with, and potentially, of course, into adulthood, the career path you will take, the lifestyle you will lead, etc., etc., etc. And of course, the same applies for whether you're assigned male sex at birth as well. Of course, the challenge comes in that we all, whether you are, so another thing to get clear about is gender identity and sexual orientation are not the same thing. So whether you are a heterosexual male or heterosexual female, we all have a level of maleness and femaleness within us. And so it's almost a continuum, if you like. So hence you might get a heterosexual male who has some feminine traits and qualities, in the same way you might have a female who is also heterosexual, who has some male qualities or characteristics. So I think sex is very binary. Gender is absolutely not. So it's very, very nuanced. And in terms of how you feel inwardly, in terms of your gender identity, whether that is male, female, or non binary. So you may not identify explicitly as a male or a female. This is regardless of your genitalia, frankly.
So if I so basically, sex
Yeah.
is basically how you're born, and gender is how you identify. And you said
Yeah,
there's a whole spectrum there, and I assume a
absolutely.
majority of people identify closer to one sex or the other, and then everybody else is in the middle, sort of thing. Um,
Yeah,
and that also means that we've now got labels for all of that. So we
exactly.
hear things like cis and intersex and all that. Can you maybe give us a little bit more on the labels so we know?
My God.
Because I hate labels personally. I just want to
Yeah.
accept people as they are.
Yeah.
But it seems
We
like people want to identify with labels. So let's put the labels out there so we at least understand what they mean.
honestly, we would honestly be here all day with labels. So there are so many different labels when it comes to gender identity and sexual orientation. There's just so many, Extine, to be honest. It would just be crazy. But I tell you what I'll do is let's talk about very simple yet quite what becoming more widely used labels like cisgender, transgender now. So cisgender basically means that your gender identity matches the sex you were assigned at birth. So I consider myself a cisgender female. So I was assigned female at birth, and my gender identity matches that. So I'm therefore considered cisgender. You also have people, of course, on the opposite space of that in terms of the transgender community. And that just simply means that your sex assigned at birth does not match with your gender identity, and therefore you actually you may go through a body dysmorphia whereby you are fundamentally in the wrong body. And so therefore some people do go through various stages of transitioning their gender. Some people, it may extend only to their outward appearance, if you like, and the way in which they dress, perhaps wear their hair, and so forth. Other people choose to have more invasive surgeries and so forth, which enable them to overcome that body dysmorphia, so that the body that they have and see in the mirror represents that which they feel is the right body for them. So it is not really for any of us to judge what is and is not the right way to live, behave, feel about gender. It's very, very, not only is it nuanced, but it's very, very individual and personal. And we should all respect the individual's
What
choice.
does cis stand for?
I don't think it actually stands for anything. I don't think it does. I might be wrong in that regard, but I think it's just the term that comes together with cisgender. I can look it up. To be honest, it
And
might be
we'll
it
put it in
might
the
be
links on
same
the
gender.
below. Yeah.
Yeah, we tend to hear it more and more, and it is fundamentally about matching the
Hmm.
same gender. But I couldn't give you a dictionary definition on that, I'm afraid.
And then where would gender fluidity fit into that?
Again, so I talked about the fact that we're on a spectrum here. So there again, we're going into so many different labels, but gender isn't binary. Gender identity is not binary for everyone. So some people may feel more male in certain situations, more female in other situations, and they may express themselves, which again is another thing entirely. So gender expression, they may choose to express themselves in different ways, outwardly in the way in which they communicate, dress, etc. And they may behave and express themselves in a more masculine way sometimes, and more feminine way in others. And that's just an element of gender fluidity. And as I say, I'm not a fan of labels, but I appreciate the sentiment behind your question. But I think that actually what we have to I say have to, what it would be nice if people did was just accept that in the same way that some of us have different color hair, or wear different size shoes, or choose different career paths, some of us just express ourselves differently in terms of our gender, and it's actually just another part of being a unique human being. Um, and as I say to a lot of people, when you're not harming anyone, you're just looking to live your life in the best way that you can, and in a way that fits how you emotionally feel as well as physical. Then does that really matter to anyone? It shouldn't, perhaps. But
I
we
think
do find ourselves in these big debates about
mm,
it all.
I think for me, it's one of the things that I've been harping on in businesses is that that all of us are unique. And the moment we, as leaders or managers within the business, understand the uniqueness of the individual,
Hmm.
we can see what's the best way for that person to contribute to a team or to an organization. And to me, gender expression, gender identity is just another unique characteristic. It's just another attribute. It shouldn't define who we are or what we're allowed or not allowed to express. And I
Mm.
think typically, you and I won't go walking around in Dubai holding hands. The problems that we can experience with that can be quite catastrophic. Um, Dubai is an example, but I wouldn't do that in Moscow either. So,
I think, do you mean with our respective partners rather than each other?
well, if
Exchange.
I'll hold your hand, not a problem. I
Yeah,
think we'll be
actually,
safe. We did that, yes. But if I took my husband to Russia and held his hand in public, yeah, it can be catastrophic. And so I think what people don't tend to understand is that when you're trying to be yourself, it's such a powerful thing when you can be, but when you're not allowed to be your whole self, when you go to work or when you engage with other people, when it feels like you're not allowed to be who you are, it is really destructive. Some of the most problems we get with burnout and things like that is when people can't be themselves. And then we're not even talking about gender and gender identity or expression yet.
and it goes deeper than that, sadly, doesn't it? Because it's people take their own lives, on the back of this kind of stuff. It's quite a lot more than just burnout in many cases,
Mm,
sadly. And I think with so much of this, it's almost like businesses, they they almost want to do what they've always done, right? So it's, let's behave in the comfortable way, in the way in which we've worked, where we have the same kind of faces around the boardroom table, because that feels safe, especially if they're a bit like, one's own face, as it were. I feel more comfortable, I can relate, etc. Just, without kind of generalizing the entire transgender community here, but just give some thought. I know several people who are identify as transgender, who have unquestionably said that what they found so interesting is, certainly in their business and their lives, they can both appreciate the male and female perspective, and they can also appreciate the way in which male and female treatment differs in business and in life. So if you almost think about, dare I say, I mean this not at all flippantly, but it's almost a buy one, get one free, right? So you're almost getting two perspectives here in one,
yeah.
from the same person who has that. It's not just let's read a book and think about it. This is that lived experience, which is so incredibly valuable to any business, because whether that business appreciates it or not, there will be a percentage of their customer population, stakeholder population, and as well as employee population that may identify in these categories, either now or in the future,
Mm.
or maybe in the process of transitioning their gender identity and sexual identity. So these are kind of things that the consequences of isolation can be catastrophic for anyone, but also the missed opportunities in business can be
Mm.
another. And so I think, to the point around leadership, it's so much is about just developing even a modicum of understanding to what those leaders and leadership teams currently have. It can make a massive difference for each and every person,
I
and
think
because.
Yeah,
Sorry,
sure, yeah.
sorry, Exting.
Go ahead.
Let
Yeah.
me just finish this tiny bit, just to say that, this whole bring one's whole self to work is something that we hear a lot. You mentioned it just then, and that's why I'm mentioning it. I think we're starting to move beyond that. It's because it has to be about not just bringing one's whole self to work, but feeling absolutely safe to do so,
Mm,
and being absolutely valued for doing so, and feeling absolutely understood when we do. It can't be a case of I can bring my whole self to work sometimes, or with some people, or in some circumstances. That's not really bringing your whole self to work. So I think we
mm,
have to look at the holistic big picture when it comes to organizations and employee well-being.
mm. I think so too. The one thing that's been nagging for me is that we're asking a lot. When
Of
I've
who?
been of people around us, because I mean I've been out at work since probably 20 years now, more longer, almost 30 years, and it always felt like I'm constantly educating people, you know. And I think it's a transition, no pun intended, that we need to make it work as well. We can't expect everybody to know everything and do all the right things all in one go at the flick of a switch. We need to have the dialogue. We need to have the conversation to help further understanding. I mean, that's one of the
Of
reasons I
course.
ask you what are these labels, because I'm not sure if everybody understands what they mean or what the implications are. And I mean, you can put a stamp on me and go like, "There's that faggot over there," when you're not in my face, or you can say, "Well, here's my gay colleague," or it doesn't matter how you express that.
Or
Some of those things can,
here's my colleague Eckstein.
or just call me Extend precisely.
Maybe that would be nice, but yeah.
I would just like to be me, um, and be accepted for that. That's one side of it. But we also need to look at the other side. What is the biological problems with that? In that people don't necessarily understand other people's facial expressions. There's some of the work that Baron Cohen did at Oxford is specifically for people with autism, shows us that there's a spectrum, but also a bell curve around people reading people's faces and emotions. And when we do that, we can see when we cause pain, and we have a natural biological mechanism that if I see I'm causing you pain, I back off.
Mm-hmm.
And there's two problems within that. One, if I'm blind, all right, I cannot see, and that's usually has to do with different colors of skin or facial structures. For instance, Chinese faces have always been really difficult for me to read, right? And I've worked really hard on trying to improve that. Whereas African faces have been much easier for me because I grew up in Africa. And so if we cannot see that somebody else is hurting, our assumption is that because we can't see it, they must either be lying, but we never look at our own role in that. And then the
Mm-hmm.
other side is the moment we add a label, and that's why I wanted to start with labels, is that when we add that label, we dehumanize. Because when we're about 9 months of age, we already starting to have group forming, and everybody that looks like us, we can see their faces. But the moment we classify people into a group, it's easier to say, well, those people, Republicans, Democrats, Tories, gay, straight, all of a sudden we're that person is just part of a group and not human anymore. And I'm wondering what can we do in businesses to create the understanding that one, you may be blind, and two, just be a little bit sensitive.
Yeah, I mean, you're going into real specifics there around sort of reading facial expressions and so forth, and I'm certainly no expert and don't profess to be an expert in reading facial expressions. But what I would say is, if we're looking at inclusion and inclusive working cultures at a holistic level, then we've got to start talking about it. We've got to start actually, again, doing the work. And I know this sounds so basic. What tends to happen is, people like me, who kind of consults with organizations about inclusive leadership strategy and so forth. I find that so often I am preaching to the converted, if you like. The people who are quote unquote in the room are people who are already on board with it. And, it is the very people who are not on board with it who need to be in the room, but obviously they're not in the room. Um, and there's you've kind of got a couple of elements going on. So you've got the elements of um, I don't I don't actually value difference, right? So you've got people who they might give it lip service, but really they don't really value difference, and they don't really like difference. They have probably not even unconscious biases. They have conscious biases, and they don't like it. They don't want it. Actually, a lot of people, I think, especially in senior positions, feel threatened by bringing in more diversity, and I mean their own position being threatened and so forth. You've also then got people who are scared about it, so they understand that it's important, but like it or don't like it, the dominant players predominantly in businesses globally are white, straight men. And I say that not with malice, that's just how it is. And those are the privileged voices that can be heard. But they need to be heard for the right reasons. So therefore, they are not jeopardizing their own positions by making space for others. You just create a bigger space, right? And so you have to do the work. I mean, when George Floyd was murdered, and the resurgence of Black Lives Matter came about, and people were talking about racism and anti-racism and so forth. This kind of work started, and people were quickly sort of seeking out their black and brown colleagues to tell me what to do, tell us how to be anti-racist, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And a message that we heard so much was do the work. Because as you mentioned there, it isn't about, let's bring the token gay or transgender person or whatever person out of their little closet and onto our stages to educate us about what we have to do and why and what it's like and so on. There is an important part to be played in hearing about those real life experiences. But I'm a white woman who, why would I understand racism? They talk about racism is not a black problem, it's a white problem, and it's so true. So in the same way that I would say to other people, do at least some of the work yourself. I took ownership for doing some of the work around racism and anti-racism work myself. And that's surely something we can all do. And the breadth of humanitarian knowledge, does that make, if that makes sense? But the wider our humanitarian circle then becomes, the more we can, as business leaders, create products and services and for the diversity within our society, as well as create the environment that allows every worker to bring their whole selves to work, quote unquote, absolutely authentically, not kind of only when it suits, but you have to do the work to put the things in place to make sure that can happen.
It makes sense. I think one of the things that struck me as you were talking was that they're still inappropriate. When we talk about the whole person, it doesn't mean that if you're how can I say that without using expletives, kind of person, it's still not appropriate to behave in a way that hurts others. So it doesn't matter what you identify as gender or if what the color of your skin is, or any of the other, let's say, unique aspects of a human being.
Yeah.
Bringing your whole self just means that you bring your whole human self.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you think about it, for anybody watching the video recording, I have a map of the world on the wall behind me in my office, and that is not just a nice picture, but that is a metaphor really for the fact that we all have our own unique map of the world. We are all, as human beings, made up, we're multifaceted, right? We have so many different component parts. We are, we're not just our gender or our age or our color. We are multifaceted as human beings, and every person is. And and of course, those component parts of our identity, or that intersectionality, I suppose, which is really the term we use in this space, will influence our map of the world, which is basically how we think, feel, behave, express ourselves, and experience this world. And so this is why this work can be so incredibly challenging, because no one person's identity makeup and intersectionality, and therefore map of the world, can be the same as another's identically. It just won't be the case. So it is long-term work. There are no quick fixes. And this is why, that, at the time of this recording, George Floyd was killed, I think, 2 years ago now, possibly a little longer, but at least 2 years ago now. And still we're navigating some of the infant stages of this inclusion landscape. And still we're ticking diversity boxes and bringing in quotas without without really doing the proper work, if that makes sense, of creating those environments where people can thrive. It is hardly any surprise people are resigning from their roles in droves, quite frankly.
I think you're touching on something interesting there as well. It's a conversation I had with Jennifer. She's the immediate past president of the Mississippi Bar Association. And she just talked about the work that she did there. Because, I mean, Mississippi, you can imagine what that says. And so the Mississippi bar has two bars. They have the compulsory bar, where everybody pays into and gets supposedly represented by. And they have the Magnolia bar, which was started, I think, in the 1950s or early 60s, which basically represents only black lawyers, because they didn't find their representation in the compulsory bar. And so Jennifer made some changes and got them put through, and unanimously accepted, to create new diversity and inclusion committees and all that. And then also brought in quite a large chunk of the Magnolia bar side to the general bar, and implemented things just almost summarily. So it created a lot of opportunities. It now allows people to be, which also made sure that there's not a single person in a committee. It's always at least two people of color in the same committee, so that you know that they're never alone. So I think that helped. But we also talked about that the conversation is not done. Just because the policy has changed, or the implementation has partially been done, the conversation is not done, because the pain that you go through is something that you also need to resolve for yourself and within the context. I mean, as we grow up, whatever discrimination we experience, it creates what we call dendrites, or called like so basically ways or feelers that we put into the world, that becomes more sensitive in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And so whenever we hear them at work, it just brings everything back. So if somebody tells me at work, and they go like, yeah, but I only told you this once. What people don't realize is, but I've already heard it 12 times today.
Yeah, I mean, that's the there's a great video out there actually, which is about microaggressions are like mosquito bites, and I'd highly recommend your listeners watch it. It's like 2 or 3 minutes in length, and it literally is. It's just a wonderful way of highlighting how microaggressions manifest. So it's if you think about, I don't know whether you're the sort of person that gets bitten by mosquitoes. I'm not, so I rarely get bitten by a mosquito, and when I do, it's really annoying. But it's just a mosquito, right? So I'll just slap it away and that's it, done. But and imagine that's a microaggression, so you may only receive that kind of I don't know, passed off as banter or inappropriate comment very occasionally. So it doesn't really matter. It doesn't bother you. It's just now and again. But then there are people who just get bitten by mosquitoes like all the time.
Mm.
And what happens is to use the mosquito piece, but is there is at one point that one mosquito is just one mosquito too many, and you absolutely flip out, and you almost overreact
Mm-hmm.
to people around you, who then kind of go, wow, it's only a mosquito bite, but they don't realize that you've had hundreds of these over maybe the course of a day, and for some people. So I'm making a much more serious point than the lightheartedness of that video, but nevertheless, that makes the serious point as well, that when people are constantly bombarded with these kind of, oh, well, it's only a little joke, or, it was only saying, or whatever, or something inappropriate, tiny, tiny, tiny things. And then suddenly they see somebody, freak out, overreact, according to them, go ballistic, if you like, then they turn around and then blame the person again and go, wow, you're so, why are you overreacting? And in the video, they talk about, they've got a black woman playing the role, if you like, and say, oh, another angry black woman, which goes to reinforce a stereotype, that people
Man,
use,
yeah.
and without realizing everything that's gone on under the surface. And again, we go back to the map of the world that we all have, and how that shapes our experience and beliefs and assumptions about others.
So if you were to say to leaders, managers, people that have decision-making power out there, or people that bring groups of people together, so lead teams, for instance, here are 2 tips that you can do tomorrow, okay, to make a difference. What would that be?
2? Only 2? Okay. So, well,
I'm sure
first
you
of
have a
all,
little. You can send me a whole list.
yeah,
We'll
I
put it
do.
on the
Yeah,
website. But
yeah.
let's say 2 that will
All
make
right.
a difference. It's easy to implement and do immediately.
Okay. Well, I'm not going to say things are easy to do or implement and can get done immediately. We can start immediately,
Mm-hmm.
but I would say one of the first things would be to engage with somebody either internally or externally about creating a long-term strategy. I've said already, this is not quick work. I'll say it again. If you think you can change your business from a non-inclusive one to an inclusive one overnight, you're grossly mistaken and wasting your time, frankly. So this is not a quick fix. So I would say invest some time, space, and possibly money in working alongside someone to create a strategy long term of how it could look. That would be my first thing, if you're not already doing that. Secondly, I would say, and I say this to a lot of people, we talk a lot in the marketplace about DE and I, or whichever way around you say it, which tends to be diversity, equity or equality, and inclusion. And what has been happening such a lot is we're focusing on the D, the diversity. And the diversity, of course, simply means difference. So this would potentially lend itself to tokenism if we're not careful. Whereas I work with organizations and I ask them to focus on the E and the I, the equity and the inclusion first. So this is where you can proactively start looking at creating an environment where people feel safe, valued, and understood at work. And this in turn will enable you to much more easily attract diverse talent. And of course, because you're looking at equity and inclusion, you'll be focusing on where you can find such diverse talent and thinking differently about your recruitment methods. So, first tip, put a strategy together and recognize the long-term nature of this. Second tip, focus your efforts around the E and the I of DEI. That doesn't mean diversity doesn't matter, but it means that diversity will come much easier if you've already got an equitable and inclusive environment. 2 tips.
Thank you. So then the next one is, we're sitting in a talent shortage at the moment. It's everybody.
Are we?
Well, I've heard from you that people say that.
They do, and it's so interesting. I mean, I spent 15 years working in recruitment. I have been out of operational recruitment for some years now, so I am not going to deny wholeheartedly that there is a talent shortage. That would be flippant of me and remiss. So let's just say there is a battle for talent that has not been felt in the marketplace for many years. That's what I will say. Um, is there talent out there? This is my point, that is being untapped. Yes, there is. When I think the latest figures suggested, this is in the UK, 600,000 people with disabilities are out of work and looking for work. Um, that's talent out there.
Mm,
Now, there are people who want to work and who can bring something to the table. The problem, I believe, is, well, there's a number of problems. One, um, we are so, and I say the collective we here, businesses are so used to saying we want someone that can hit the ground running. They profess to invest in their people, but don't really train them. They just need them to get on and do. And so, uh, and so therefore they're looking for the, again, quote unquote, finished article, which many people won't be. They're looking for previous experience and skills and historical data, which is helpful, but they're not also looking at potential. They're not looking at what they could do to invest in someone that didn't have all the skills, but had some of the skills and qualities and characteristics required to succeed in whatever that role might be.
mm,
Um, and they're not thinking about recruitment differently. To take people with disabilities, for example, as something to work with, things around, I'm not going to get into the legalities because they change country to country, but when we think about the term reasonable adjustments, which may need to be made, which is certainly in the UK legal requirement for employers to make, um, I think, again, this scares some employers. It's like, oh God, we've got to do all these reasonable adjustments, but actually some of them can be very small
mhm,
and not expensive. In fact, not costly at all in some cases. Just need some additional forethought and discussion with the person in question, and and they can be made, and that person can thrive, and feel valued and safe and understood. Um, but I think we shy away, and we're in this. I think a lot of employers are in panic mode at the moment. We just
mm,
need to get that
mm.
bum on the seat, but they're not thinking about the different bum they could get on that seat, frankly. And
I
and
think
you
what
know,
but people tend to forget is that it's not just the skill and the experience that counts.
mhm,
Past performance in a specific context doesn't guarantee that people will be performing in
exactly.
any context. I mean, that's something we've been saying for years, but people don't seem to get it. And that who you are as a person is sometimes more important to make sure that you fit within a team than just what you can do. Because I mean, with agile ways of working, we've now seen that teams can perform much better when you find the right person to fit the team and not just the task. And so so some of the stuff that I've been working here in the Netherlands anyway, that I find is very interesting is this guy that erected a company specifically for working with people on the spectrum. And so the government subsidies that would normally go to an organization, they basically say, just pay our person that we place with you standard rate, all right? And we'll make sure that we help with the transitioning. So advising the managers or advising the leaders within an organization as to how to work with people with Asperger's or on the spectrum or with autism. And some of the companies are actually realizing amazing productivity increases because
Mhm.
these people stick so so on task. There's just they get enjoyment out of do the repetition, and you can like there's a lot of people that don't. So let's find the right person, with the right motivators or drivers, those things they get joy from to get it to fit in the right slot.
It is, it's not always straightforward, and I get that. And but that example that you just gave, that says to me that's somebody that has really figured out what they can proactively be doing to make sure that the environment they create is one that can be
Mm,
productive for certain people with Asperger's and autism and so forth. So that's the kind of proactive behavior, if you like, that I'm talking about here. And um, there is one thing I will just touch on, just again, for perhaps anyone listening, when you hear these terms team fit and culture fit and so on. Um, yes, absolutely, there has to be a fit for the team, but I think let's be clear on what that maybe should mean in terms of it doesn't mean they have to be like the other people in the team, characteristics wise. Um, uh, when we so often, this is what happens, and this is how homogenous teams evolve and develop and sustain. And because we're always saying, oh, we need someone that's going to fit in with the team and fit in with the culture and so on. So they're looking for carbon copies of themselves ultimately, or the majority in that organization. Now, I appreciate what you meant in relation to that team fit is someone that's really going to complement the team from a
Mm,
working perspective and a creative perspective. And so sometimes I will use the term like culture add or culture build rather than culture
mhm,
fit, because you want someone that has some of the same similar characteristics, maybe values that align quite nicely with the organizational values, that they have demonstrable skills to be able to say, look, this is how I can develop your organization because of something similar I did elsewhere. Therefore, you're allowing the variety and diversity of experience and skill. But you're not saying you have to look, sound, feel, think, communicate in exactly the same way as everyone else on this team,
mm.
right? So there is just a subtle difference, but it's an important one to make.
I think that's where the difference between you and I suddenly came clear as well. We were talking right at the beginning about masculine and feminine sort of characteristics, and my metaphor at the moment is not in words but in pictures. And I tell people a team is like an ikebana flower arrangement.
Yeah.
It's great to create the flower arrangement, but the moo of it, the emptiness space,
Mm-hmm.
is the most important. So that's the spaces we fill with the right person. So in a flower arrangement, if you like that, if you look at every single gap that there is, every gap is unique,
Mm-hmm.
and every gap is special, and every gap is necessary. Otherwise, the flower arrangement is incomplete.
Right.
And so when we see these gaps and we see how they're shaped and how a person fits within that, and there will be parts that don't fit.
Mm-hmm.
That's always going to be the case. But as long as we have a majority of that fitting, I think we can make beautiful shapes and beautiful flower arrangements, or we can make some really great Zen gardens.
Yeah, quite. And it's a nice way to look at it, because actually, even in the plant kingdom, in the flower kingdom, you're going to get some flowers, plants that are toxic to others, and there's that toxic personality that can come in as an individual, but can infiltrate the entire bouquet, that
Mm,
entire arrangement and destroy it all. But actually, you can get absolute diversity. So a flower or a plant that looks very, very different to all the others, but complements beautifully,
mm,
maybe in terms of the fragrance or the aesthetics or whatever it might be, but complements beautifully and even maybe strengthens the other flowers or
mm.
plants in the immediate vicinity. And that's the kind of thing that you want, isn't it, to make that absolute beautiful arrangement. Love that analogy.
I think it's also for me a case of what we said earlier, the finding the right cultural fit.
Hmm.
And you talk about carbon copies. I think also that the same is not a cultural fit.
Hmm.
The same is just tend towards the average, and it's a pet peeve I have with the acceptance of average.
Mm.
When we all accept average as the way to go, we're accepting mediocrity. If we really want to shine and create something that's exceptional, we need that diversity. We need the outliers. We don't need the only humdrum, yes, to get the job done, but we need to also bring in the flashy, the different, sometimes even the morose, to have our counterpoints. It's like it's like a countertenor with a mezzo soprano. They're not the soprano and they're not quite the tenor, but they have, or the contralto. They all have this just slightly different voice
Mm.
that really makes for a choir or for a trio to sing the most beautiful music. And so I think we should start looking for those people that are just slightly different in key.
Yeah, and you almost, when you think about it, what are businesses? Why do they exist, right? So you could ultimately say to make money. In that's just a consequence, really. But they're probably there to create products, or provide a service. It's usually one of those two things. So if you're creating products for the masses, I use that term, I guess just broadly as it is, but if you're creating products that you want to appeal to the masses, and the ideators that create this product are all similar in some shape or form, then what you're likely to get is early agreement, early buy-in, and early adoption from the people in your organization to go with that particular product. And now imagine that you had a diverse team of people that are on that sort of project or creation team or ideating over a new product, who will all look at things with their different map of the world, right? Their different lenses. And they will be able to, what they will do is they will challenge back, they will push back, they will say, no, hang on a minute, that might work for you, but that wouldn't work for me. And so the process of innovation will take longer. It will have more hurdles. It will have more pushback. It will take longer to get people on board, everybody on board, and create that buy-in. But sometimes you have to slow down to speed up, don't you? And that is an example of, by having that thorough ideation from diverse minds, the conflict, the challenges, the frustrations, in fact, that leaders will have in teams such as those will lead to better results, because actually the ultimate product that is created, the same applies with services, that is created, will have already factored in the diverse population who will potentially buy it or use it. And so therefore you're going to save, well, probably make a lot more money in the long run, save time in the long run, etc. But of course, it just doesn't always work like that, because it's almost the road or path of least resistance is where we just go, hey, what do you think? Person like me, and that I've always asked. I quite like it, because I have to say that because I like you. And what do you think? Oh yeah, well, I like you as well, and you've just said you like my ideas, so I better say I like yours. And I'm making light of this, but ultimately this is what starts to happen with homogenous teams. You don't get anybody saying, hang on a minute, I don't think you've considered this, or I actually think you're wrong here because we kind of, our brains like to be right. We like to be right. So it's quite challenging to potentially bring someone in that's going to tell us we're wrong. It's a brave thing to do.
I think that is a brave thing. I think there's just two things there that you said that just triggered for me. One is, I don't know if you know Thomas Vedelsborg, if you ever heard of him. It's this guy, wonderful guy, Danish guy that I met in the US at a writers' workshop. But Thomas's thing is problem solving. And he says, most often we're not solving the right problem. The example that he uses is lifts in buildings. One example. He says why people complained about these high skyscrapers in New York, for instance, and it takes a really long time for the lift to arrive, and you stand there twiddling your thumbs and getting annoyed and frustrated. And so he normally asks people, what is the solution? And people tend to go for all the technical solutions, make the lift faster, make them go only up a certain amount of floors and then another lift, so you never have to wait too long and things like that. The solution, however, came from a different direction, and that is put up a mirror. Because the time that you wait doesn't feel that long. So people look in the mirror and go like, oh, is my hair right? Is my tie right? And things like that. And by the time they've done that, the lift's there. So if we're solving for the wrong problem, we end up with a solution that doesn't really work, no matter how much effort we put into it. And I think diversity is one of those things that help us identify the problem and look at it from different perspectives. And so it's not just about the amount of solutions we get on the table for innovation. It's about looking at the right problem. The other thing I think is also interesting is a study was done, I think it was MIT, I'm not 100% sure, but it was a study done on why teams with more women tend to solve more problems. And it was not just a case of, okay, add one. So you could add, as long as there's a man left, it seemed to work. It was really weird. And they started digging into this because it had obviously nothing to do with cohesion and with engagement and a lot of other things it didn't work with. What they found out is that it was a small but crucial part, and that is cognitive empathy. The ability to see other people's emotions also meant that women were able to see, that person there has an idea. So they tend to have the more of the group engaged, more people engaged, and everybody participating. And that created more ideas. So I think that's also something that touches maybe on what you said, is you need to have that engagement that comes through inclusion. And to include people, we need to make sure that everybody's heard. And if you can't see it, you need the process to do so.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's where all the stuff around psychological safety comes in, right? And it's also why I encourage business leaders to focus on the E and the I of D&I rather than the D, because you can't just bring a whole range of diversity in and say, right, solve this problem, because then there's no trust, there's no safety, right? My perspective won't be understood at all, or it'll be shot down by the dominant voices in the room, or whatever. So, by having that inclusive working practice, what you're doing is you're looking to create space. Psychological safety, contrary to what some people report or believe, is not about, everyone can make mistakes and it's fine. It isn't quite about that. It's about the fact that as a unit, we feel safe to admit our mistakes in front of others and we know we won't be judged for those, and instead we will not look at this as a human problem, but we will look at this as or rather a blame situation, but we will look at this as okay, what can we all learn from this and do differently in the future? It also enables us to be vulnerable with one another, explain when we're struggling, explain when we're off track or whatever it might be, and we get that reciprocally from our leaders as well as ourselves, because again, you can't as a leader say it's okay, it's psychological safety is in play here, you can all be vulnerable with me, if you then as a leader are not sharing your own vulnerabilities back. So yeah, so it's got to be a sort of safe reciprocal environment. So but when you have that in place, imagine that, going back to that example there of creating that new product or service, where somebody says, well, this is obviously going to work because it's always worked, and somebody says, I'm not sure it will, so I feel comfortable and safe to speak up. There won't be reprisal. I'm not sure it will because in the past you didn't speak about that. To which the person then responds, you're right. I had never really thought about it like that. I guess I got it a bit wrong there. So how can we come together and take that forward? That's just an example of it in action, rather than the person trying their very best to justify why they were right in the first place, which we get so often in businesses, that they don't realize even that there is no psychological safety present. So you have to look at the way the organization operates at various levels, to really know if it's there or not. But that's key. It's a critical part.
Mm.
Critical part.
How do we create that with working from home? I mean, now with COVID and the post-COVID, we're going to be in an environment, I think, for a few years at least,
Yeah.
where hybrid working is going to be the norm, if not complete remote working. How do we still create engagement and loyalty towards the company and to people that you work with?
You communicate with them. Yeah, I mean, I'm not actually trying to make light of it. I think sometimes what's happened. So let's just kind of rewind, if you like, to start of pandemic. One of the first things that I saw kind of being peddled, if you like, by organisations on my sort of business LinkedIn and all the rest of it, I could see lots of people looking to promote these staff monitoring systems. So, you can keep an eye on when your staff have logged in and whatever. And I was absolutely horrified. And I think lots of people were horrified, but there was still, nevertheless, lots of businesses that took them up on that offer. So this is absolutely the first sign of, I don't trust you and I'm going to keep my eye on you. So that is never going to make someone feel good, right? The as things have evolved, I think we have, as organisations, we have started to become more comfortable in the space. Now, notwithstanding the nuances, there are some people for whom home working has been the most horrific, worst experience ever. And that could be because they are in isolation. It could also be because they just wish they were. They've got so many things and distractions and family and dogs and so on going around them that they're finding that hard to kind of keep going and focused. For another portion of the population, that has been the biggest revelation ever. About, oh my God, I can reduce my hour, 2 hour, 3 hour commute every day by just sort of coming downstairs and sitting at my desk, work and logging on. I can be more productive. I can take a break when I want to take a break, but I'm focusing on just getting the job done, right? And so for them, there's the opposite, and they're feeling safe. They have got their family or even solitude around them that works for them. So there's that kind of twofold. But I think what's really made the difference between organizations during this pandemic and the now sort of working from home or hybrid model is those that have really kept in touch and have really been very clear and open and have not stuck a post everything's gone wrong plaster on well-being, but they've considered employee well-being before well-being's gone wrong, if that makes sense. So they've kind of given some real forethought to taking care of the people in their care. And I think Simon Sinek talks about, this kind of, I can't remember what the term is, but he talks about, you are there as leaders to serve the people that are in your care. And this was grossly missing, I think, for a lot of organizations because panic was set in. Of course, there was human tragedy, economic tragedy and so forth going on all inside that. So I'm not here to judge. I'm here to just state the facts as I see them, right? And I think a lot of companies, for whatever reason, got it very wrong. And I think what's happened actually is the working population has said, hang on a minute. So if I can work remotely and do my job, and let's just say, and I like this working remotely, it is, of course, easier for me to attend an interview remotely because I haven't got to really make an excuse to my boss. I can just duck out for an hour and they'll never know. So that's easier for me to do. But also, I start to question what is important. Do I want to go back to the office? Because actually, my boss was a control freak. The people that I worked with were all snide, conniving, out for themselves. Actually, maybe the culture of the organisation isn't one where I want to go back into the office, thanks. And I really think that there's been a huge amount of that happen. We talk about woke, I don't like the term, but we talk about woke in terms of inclusion. But I think there's been a lot of woke in terms of bad leadership and organisational culture. People have said enough. And I think, well, I don't think, I know, because all the stats tell us, but people have said enough in their droves. And I think it's very, very easy for people to say, we need to get people back into the office and, keep an eye on all those kind of things. But actually working from home, or at least a hybrid working model, is absolutely here to stay for the foreseeable. Um, Of course, in some ways, it highlights some of the inequities in our society. There are certain jobs that can't be done on a hybrid model or remotely, so people have to travel. There will be, therefore, some people who are in lower paid jobs, perhaps, in the hospitality industry, for example, that also still can't have the benefit of, even if they wanted to, working from home or on a hybrid basis. But notwithstanding the vast majority of, office workers, if you like, they're going to, in the main, want a balance. Um, and and I think at their peril should organisations try and force one way or the other. But the productivity, I've gone a bit off track, but the productivity's got to be about that communication and focus on the human nature of those people rather than just as employees.
I think what I'm struggling with in that is that what on the one hand, what you've talked about now is a very transactional model. It is we go, we do the task, we disengage, we're done. On the other side is the human model, where we need to engage to get the benefit of teams or relationships that make the sum of the parts bigger. So the whole becomes bigger than the sum of its parts, which is where inclusion and diversity
Yeah.
lives. And so what I'm just concerned is that we create this dichotomy in the model where on the one side it is linear learning, let me get the job done, which is the individual performance. And on the other side, we need the inclusion and the equity and the diversity to create organizational performance or to create team performance. And how do we straddle those two?
Yeah.
Because if how do leaders settle that? Because the performance measurements that I've seen, the studies I've seen, has to do with individual performance. It doesn't look at the managerial or the leadership performance, because that is where you measure the team performance. And because we're not looking at team performance, it gives us this skewed view of, yes, individuals perform better, but the team as a whole doesn't. And those performance criteria tend to be not based on industry standard, but tend to be based on interplay between people. So Margaret Heffernan refers to that as the pecking order, sort of, I'm better than you, but I'm still really bad when it comes to the rest of the world out there. And so when we have these kind of performance metrics that doesn't really show us the right picture, are we going to make the right decisions? And will diversity and inclusion not suffer?
Well, that's why leaders have to become inclusive leaders. Simple as that. Because it's again about the understanding each and every, again, to use your analogy, flower in the vase, right? As to what level of autonomy you can give to each person and what level of support is required, and where you can actually encourage collaboration across team members. Because of course there's going to be people that say, just leave me alone and let me get on with it, but those same people still need some they either need to report in, they need to report back either or to the leader or to the other team members, or they'll have to have stakeholder engagement somewhere along the line. We can kind of list every single job in the world, but generally speaking, that kind of thing is going to be required. Now, it just may simply be that person, once they have maybe they have the level of skill and expertise and characteristic that actually they do work best freer from distractions. But that if your job role, and again, it's getting the recruitment right in the first place, but if your job role is one where actually the expectation is that there's a level of collaboration or camaraderie in some way or shape or form as part of your role, working in project teams, etc., then then that kind of has to be expected. But it's the leader's job to really think about when they hire people, first of all, looking at that point is, okay, what does that person bring to the team, but also what do they need and not need, right? There's this kind of balance, isn't there, always in leadership, between sufficient support and guidance and micromanagement, right? One of which we we need, want, and love, the other which we loathe and hate and despise, and certainly don't want. So, or we don't like to admit we do. So, it's the leader's job to get under the skin of individuals, to understand their needs, their values, their working practice, their strengths, their development areas, all of those kind of things we could talk about in leadership. And to do that with each individual within that team, and to do that as a team, and set those common purpose, shared goals, team values, if you like, so that the team themselves has a voice in terms of how that team ethos and culture is shaped. And then the leader then facilitates or enables that to happen in the background. Because, somebody saying, leave me alone to get on with it, well, that's not an excuse for a leader to actually leave them alone and never get in touch with them, and, etc. There's got to be more, hasn't there? And, you talk about that study about I'm better than you, and this hierarchy and this alpha. Well, there's always going to be those kind of people, right? That for whatever reason, maybe they have their own self-esteem needs that need to be fulfilled, so they need to feel that they are the best at something. We all like to feel like we're good at things, and there's not really anything wrong with that, as long as there's space created for everybody's strengths to come to the fore. And if somebody has got a strength in a particular area, great, let's showcase that. But let's also recognize that this other person may not have that same strength area, but they have a different one. So what do they bring? And how can all of those collective strengths come together to say, all right, we may individually be the strongest, even though we're pretty average in the grand scheme of the world, but collectively, when we pool all of our resources and we give each person a voice and we respect everybody's voice and we take smart risks as a team, well, that's when we really get some serious results and start to take over and create change. And I think actually inclusive leadership and transactional work can work beautifully alongside each other when it's done well.
I think we'll put an end to it there, because I think one of the things that I think has come out of this discussion with you is that inclusive leadership is something that in a way is still in its infancy, and that is something that needs a lot of growth, and it's going to become more and more important as we go forward, especially in hybrid models or in work from home models. And
Great.
finding those new ways, those new interventions for leaders, I think is one of the most important things we should do as soon as possible.
Yeah. And do you know what? I'll sort of finish my thinking on it as well. I think what's happened, I keep saying I know this stuff. And I know what has happened traditionally in organizations, because I've worked with many of them globally, is that they'll have their leadership development strategy. And, and I often support organizations with their leadership development strategy. And that is, traditional, typical leadership development stuff, right? And then they'll have this other stream, completely separate, about diversity and inclusion, or diversity, equity, inclusion. And that will be their, unconscious bias training, maybe talk about privilege or other things if you're lucky. But, though that's almost a separate strand. And so you don't necessarily, unless it's been very well coordinated, if you like, by the organization, get those leaders do their leadership development work and the diversity, equity, and inclusion work, right? Or they'll find an excuse not to do that because of all the reasons I started this conversation with, fear and so forth. And actually, what is required is that the diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and honestly, it's pretty simple when you think about it, needs to be weaved into that leadership development, because diversity, equity, and inclusion are not nice to haves. They are critical leadership skills that every business leader, new manager, tenured manager, C-suite need to have in their portfolio. And that, I will plug it. I created this program recently, the BRAVEwork program, which is about creating braver, more courageous leaders through a leadership development program that has core principles of diversity, equity, inclusion weaved into it, so that when we are talking about let me give you an example. Recruitment. We are looking at how a leader can be more equitable and inclusive in that process. When we're talking about setting up the team for success in terms of maybe a team dynamic model, for instance, you're looking at the nuances that culture and identity might bring to that mix and the additional challenges. So all of these kind of things, if they are weaved in to what already exists, it just makes life so much easier, and it stops diversity, equity, and inclusion being left to HR or potentially even a dedicated diversity, equity, and inclusion team, but it brings it into the mainstream and it says unashamedly, humanity is everybody's responsibility. And the people that each leader cares for, recruits, hires, and develops of the future, they will all have their own identity and so on, nuances. And the leader needs to be equipped to deal with those and nurture those. And that's what's going to give the best business results for the future.
I want to thank you, Jackie, for being with us today. It is always stimulating and interesting to talk to you. And thanks for coming around and sharing some of your amazing insights.
Well, it has been a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me, Extine. Always good to see you, my friend.
The thing what stood out for me in this talk with Jackie was that there are so many labels that I need to get comfortable with and change my mind around, and then also be cognizant of whatever I say and how that impacts others. It sometimes feels a little bit overwhelming. But allowing idiots like me the opportunity to have a conversation and talk about those things that matter most to people, and where we don't always know what to say, I think we can ask, please help us to understand. Please show me and other people that don't know what you're going through, what it is. And to do that, we need an organization and a sustained trust environment. So if you're in a leadership position, how can you create that trust environment that allows people to feel safe, to talk about those things that trouble them, those things they experience every day, or those things that make their life just a living hell? Are you open? Are you willing to listen? Well, I'm going to try. I hope so do you. Now go out there, be exponential, and do something nice for someone else. You can find us on the web by going to podcast.exponentially.me. We will also find additional media resources and some amazing insights.